Carlos Marcello and Mike Maroon were staying at the Biltmore Hotel, and that's when it got strange. Two Secret Service guys were parked on them. By 8 that night, 3 more walked in. No warnings, no explanations. Just, pack your bags. Carlos and Mike barely had time to grab their things before they were shoved into a station wagon. They thought they were going back to the airport. They weren't. The car rolled through the night and crossed the border, not into the US, not even into Mexico, but into El Salvador. Not the city, the jungle. They stopped at some army camp out in the middle of nowhere, and suddenly Carlos and Mike were at the mercy of Salvadoran soldiers. The camp commander took their $3,000, made them sign it over for safekeeping. 6 days they kept them locked up, interrogated them, humiliated them. Then, at 11 o'clock one night, an officer stepped into their cell. "Get ready, Mr. Marcello. We're taking you to Honduras." Carlos tried to slow the clock. "Wait for daylight," he said. But the officer wasn't having it. "No. Orders are orders. You're going now." At least they gave him back the $3,000, but Carlos knew what was coming next. 2 guards, just for him and Mike. An escort, they called it. Carlos called it something else. A setup. They stuffed their money into their shoes. Every dollar. Then the guards crammed them onto a beat-up old bus that started climbing into the mountains. For 6 hours, the engine coughed and wheezed up a pitted, narrow road through the jungle. And then, without ceremony, without a word, they stopped. The guards tossed them off the bus like trash. Just a dirt road and the trees. No houses, no signs. Nothing. The bus rumbled away, leaving Carlos and Mike in the dust, alone. There was no choice. They started walking, and it was hell. 8 hours, 17 miles, no food, no water, just the heat and the road and the weight of the jungle pressing down on them. Carlos, built for the lowlands of Louisiana, couldn't breathe in that thin mountain air. He collapsed, once, twice, face down in the dirt. By the 3rd time, he was spitting his last breath into the dust. And all he could think of was Bobby Kennedy, that rich kid who'd thrown him into this nightmare. He told Mike, "If I don't make it, if this is it, you tell my brothers what that kid Bobby done to us. You tell 'em, do what they gotta do." But Carlos wasn't the type to stay down. He dragged himself to his feet and kept going. And finally, they stumbled into a village. The people fed them, let them rest. But rest wasn't the end of it. They hired 2 Indian boys, guides, to lead them to the nearest airstrip. But halfway down the trail, something shifted again. Carlos saw it in their eyes, the whispers, the glances. Suddenly those machetes didn't look like tools. They looked like weapons. And Carlos, ribs screaming, body broken, knew exactly what was coming. So, he made the move. He and Mike slowed, dropped back, then disappeared, plunging off the path into the underbrush. The jungle tore at them, thorns slicing their skin, rocks battering their knees. Somewhere in the fall, Carlos felt something crack. Later, he'd find out. 3 ribs, broken. But they lost the boys, and they lived. Hours more, pushing through the brush, until finally they stumbled into a provincial airstrip. They didn't think. They paid whatever it took for a plane, anything, just to get to Tegucigalpa, the Honduran capital. When they landed, they hit a hotel and crashed. 2 days of sleep. Out cold. Mike went back to the States to let the family know Carlos was alive. Beaten, but alive. And Carlos? He laid low for 2 weeks, but not forever. He wasn't staying in Honduras. He was going home. Somehow, because this was Carlos Marcello, he got a forged visa and a ticket to Miami. And, On the morning of that flight, he played it at old school. He went to 9 churches, lit a candle in each one, left a couple dollars in every collection plate. Then he went to the airport, got on the plane, and landed in Miami. Immigration searched for him. Customs searched for him. But those papers are perfect. He walked right through, right out the door. And he didn't stop. He got into a cab and told the driver, "New Orleans. Take me home. Go around back." When he walked through the door, his wife nearly screamed. "Carlos," she said, "immigration's watching the house, day and night." But Carlos, bruised and beaten, barely shrugged. "Let 'em watch," he said. "I'm giving myself up anyway." Now, here's the thing. That story, the one he told. People say it ain't the truth. The House Select Committee on Assassinations, they tapped some wires and uncovered the truth. Carlos didn't arrive on a commercial flight. He touched down in Miami aboard a Dominican Republic Air Force jet, flown in under the protection of General Rafael Trujillo, El Jefe himself. Trujillo wasn't just a dictator. He was a mob associate, a man whose empire thrived on Mafia support. He was deeply entangled with organized crime, laundering drug money, running gambling operations and bribing officials, all while building casino empires with his underworld allies. His ties to the mob stretched from Havana to Las Vegas, and his partner in many of these ventures was none other than Santos Traficante, a close friend and business associate of Carlos Marcello. Trujillo wasn't the only one pulling strings. Irving Davidson, the notorious Capitol Hill lobbyist, was another crucial ally. Davidson, with his deep ties to both the Dominican Republic and Washington's power corridors, played fixer between the mob, foreign regimes, and U.S. politicians. But here's where it turns deadly. Carlos slipped back into the U.S. just days before Trujillo was gunned down. That hit wasn't rogue. It was sanctioned. The Central Intelligence Agency orchestrated it, and it carried Robert Kennedy's personal blessing. Why? Because Robert Kennedy knew exactly who Trujillo was. He knew about Trujillo's mafia ties, his drug routes, his casino rackets, and his bribery pipelines. He knew about the general's long-standing dealings with men like Traficante and Marcello. And most of all, he feared Trujillo's influence could spark another violent uprising in the Dominican Republic, one that would plunge the Caribbean deeper into chaos, just as the failed Bay of Pigs invasion had rattled Cuba. Kennedy decided Trujillo had to go, and that decision ignited a firestorm from New York to New Orleans to Florida. The mafia bosses, who had thrived under Trujillo's protection, were outraged. His assassination didn't just kill a dictator. It destroyed a pipeline of profit and protection that stretched from the Caribbean to the U.S. underworld. And in the shadows of this power play, one man quietly returned home. Carlos Marcello, carried on the wings of a dictator and shielded by the very forces that would soon tear his world apart. Carlos had for now beat them. He got back. But this wasn't a victory. This was something else, something worse. Because they hadn't just deported him, they'd humiliated him. They had dragged him through the mud, through the jungle, torn his body and stripped his pride. And there was only one man to blame. Not immigration, not the State Department. It was Bobby Kennedy. And Carlos Marcello never forgot. And he never forgave. On June the 2nd, 1961, America and organized crime figures across the world stood shaken. Some celebrated, especially those under attack from Kennedy's administration and the Cuban exiles who had once counted on Carlos Marcello's backing. Others, like the Kennedy brothers, were stunned. Robert Kennedy, the Attorney General and the architect behind Marcello's deportation, now faced his greatest frustration. Carlos Marcello was back. The Times broke the news first. Carlos Marcello, the kingpin of New Orleans' underworld, was back on American soil. Federal agents, chasing whispers and shadows, had tracked him to the Shreveport area. Patrick Duval of the U.S. Immigration Department's Border Patrol and Edwin Smith, his partner in the manhunt, had arrived from the New Orleans office, driven by a single promise. "We'll stay here until we arrest him." They were asking for help. Through the pages of the Times, they called on the public to report any sighting of the stocky 5'4" racketeer with his greying black hair and cold brown eyes. Duval was tight-lipped about how Marcello slipped back into the States from El Salvador, but he was certain of one thing. The gangster had been in Louisiana in recent days and wasn't far from familiar haunts. Shreveport was familiar ground for Marcello. He had business interests in nearby Bossier City and kept an attorney in the area, Michael Maroon, who had flown to Guatemala to negotiate for him after his sudden deportation in April. Maroon's name surfaced again as federal agents combed Marcello's known hideouts, including the infamous Town Country Motel, a place where the racketeer had entertained powerful friends and shady associates. Duval warned, "When we catch him, he's facing a felony charge. Illegal re-entry without Justice Department approval." The pursuit was intense, with Caddo Parish Sheriff Howell Flournoy vowing full cooperation. The stakes were high. Marcello's departure on April 17th had been a spectacle-swift operation that stripped him of his power base overnight. They had snatched him from his routine check-in at the New Orleans immigration office, tossed him on a plane to Guatemala without warning or luggage. His defiant cry of kidnapping had echoed through Guatemalan newspapers, but no amount of outcry could change the outcome. Once in Guatemala, Marcello had vanished. Officials claimed he was moved to El Salvador, but neither country wanted him. From there, he slipped into the shadows. Until now. The Bossier Press wasted no time taking credit for the scoop. Their editor boasted that 3 weeks earlier, on May 12th, they had hinted that Marcello was already back in Bossier City. Their source? 2 anonymous informants, described as patriotic Americans, and, in a jab at the administration, not as far to the left as some of the Washington crowd. The press suggested that the Justice Department's chase might be more for show than justice, implying that Robert Kennedy, mockingly nicknamed Bobby Socks Bobby, might have known more than he let on. The paper, known for stirring controversy, cast doubt on the entire manhunt, asking, "If Carlos is caught, will we be treated to another spectacle of showmanship for America's gullible public?" The Bossier Press, it seemed, wasn't chasing headlines. They were chasing ghosts and scandals. Meanwhile, the News Star reported a new twist. Marcello's lawyer, Michael Maroon, declared his client was ready to surrender. Maroon, the ever-cagey mouthpiece, refused to reveal Marcello's location, but promised a news conference later that day. Yet confusion reigned. Chief Border Patrol Inspector Gray, stationed in New Orleans, flatly denied knowing whether Marcello was even in the country. His statement clashed with Patrick Duval's assertion that the gangster had already been sighted in Shreveport. "He might be up there," Gray shrugged to reporters, "and he might not." But Duval stood firm. His investigation confirmed it. Somewhere in the backroads and backrooms of Louisiana, Carlos Marcello was out there. And with him, so was the Kennedy administration's worst nightmare. That the man they had fought for 9 years to expel could deny them once more, on their own turf. And so, it began. The hunt for Carlos Marcello was more than a search for a fugitive. It was a showdown between one man and the full weight of the American government. A man who had been declared unwanted by France, Italy, and the United States alike. A man whose empire had survived deportations, indictments, and congressional hearings. A man who now, against all odds, had come home. On June the 2nd, 1961, the man they couldn't get rid of was back. Carlos Marcello, the notorious boss of the New Orleans underworld, had slipped through the cracks of borders and bureaucracy to return to the only country he ever called home. The news broke with the force of a thunderclap. The Times was the first to confirm it. federal agents were already swarming the Shreveport area, hot on his trail. Patrick Duval and Edwin Smith, both from the New Orleans Border Patrol office, weren't leaving until they had him in cuffs. The manhunt was public, messy, and desperate. Duval, tightening his lips in frustration, warned, "We'll get him. And when we do, he's facing another felony, illegal re-entry." But the feds weren't the only ones making moves. Michael Maroon, Marcello's longtime attorney from Shreveport, had stepped into the fray. He filed for a restraining order that could freeze any attempt to deport his client, again. If granted, the order would let Marcello stay within the Western Louisiana District Court's jurisdiction, free on bond, while his appeal moved through the courts. The stakes came to a head before U.S. District Judge Ben C. Dawkins, Jr. on June 3, 1961. Judge Dawkins, a no-nonsense federal man, listened as Maroon, flanked by Jack Wasserman, a heavyweight attorney from Washington, promised that if the court granted the order, Marcello would walk in and surrender. But Assistant U.S. Attorneys Gilbert Zimmerman and Boagny, carrying the government's full force, pushed back hard. They demanded that the manhunt continue without pause. Maroon, sensing the net tightening around his client, confessed to the court that he had already notified federal agents on Wednesday, 2 days prior, that Marcello intended to surrender. But it was too late. The announcement had only thrown gasoline on the fire. The feds had doubled their numbers in Shreveport, sweeping every alley and motel room in a frenzied search to grab Marcello before he could claim the protection of the court. And then came the ruling. Judge Dawkins, his voice steady and cold, refused the restraining order. There was no proof, he said, that Marcello was even in his jurisdiction. Without it, his court had no power to halt the arrest. With that, the green light was given. The hunt continued. The following day, the chase was back at full tilt. Immigration officers, led by C. Johnson, the New Orleans district director, vowed to capture Marcello and deport him before he could set foot inside a courtroom. Johnson dismissed Maroon's claims of cooperation as theatrics. "This man won't talk to us," he said flatly, "so we'll find him first." The headlines grew more frenzied. Underworld, and for every agent on his trail, there was a whisper in the shadows. How had he even made it back into the States? Had someone helped him slip through the cracks? The answer came on Monday morning, and it wasn't the agents who found him. Carlos Marcello surrendered himself. No arrests, no chase through the back roads, just a soft toot of a car horn outside his New Orleans home. When the immigration officer looked up from the driver's seat, the front door opened, and out stepped the man himself, bruised, battered, but walking tall. He climbed into the car without a word, his eyes hidden behind dark lenses, his mouth a straight line. Hours later, inside the immigration headquarters, his attorney Maroon made 3 demands. 3 hours alone with his client. A chance to post bond. That Marcello is not removed from Louisiana, even if bond was denied. But Maroon's voice carried little weight. He knew what was coming. "They'll make a grandstand play," he warned. "They'll ship him straight to McAllen, Texas, to the alien detention camp." And he wasn't wrong. By the time Marcello was processed, the Immigration Service refused to grant bail. They were holding him tight. His illegal re-entry had triggered a fresh charge, a felony, and the price was steep. Bond set at $50,000. But it didn't matter. Immigration retained custody, and no amount of money would buy his freedom. By Tuesday, the headlines read like a grim epitaph. Doors closed to crime boss Carlos Marcello, the man they called the little man in the underworld, had become something worse than a fugitive. He was a man without a country. 6 nations had slammed their doors in his face. Guatemala had deported him immediately, branding his birth records as forged. El Salvador marched him across the mountains to Honduras like a prisoner of war. Nicaragua refused him outright. Tunisia, the country he swore was his true birthplace, turned its back. Italy and France had already made their position clear: not welcome. Sitting in his cell, bruised ribs aching from his forced march through the Salvadoran mountains, Carlos Marcello faced a truth more brutal than any jail sentence. There was nowhere left to run. But if anyone thought this was the end of Carlos Marcello's story, they didn't know the man. The law had chased him across borders, over mountains, and through courtrooms, and he was still here. Carlos Marcello was more than just a crime boss. He was an architect of an invisible empire, stretching far beyond the swamps of Louisiana into the booming metropolises of Texas. And no city in the Lone Star State mattered more to him than Dallas. Dallas had no mafia family of its own, no native boss pulling the strings. It had gangsters, sure, gamblers, bookies, racketeers. But when it came to true power, it was a satellite of New Orleans. And in the world of organized crime, satellites didn't orbit on their own. They answered to one man. Marcello had spent years cultivating his grip over Texas, his influence creeping into every crack of the state's underworld. By the early 1960s, his network had become an independent, elaborately insulated operation, as one law enforcement official later put it. The Marcello machine ran smoothly. Gambling, slot machines, narcotics, real estate, and a pipeline of bribes that kept the political machinery oiled and obedient. By 1963, Marcello's racing wire service fed hundreds of bookmakers in Houston, with each one paying up to $500 a day for access. It was the same playbook he had used in Louisiana. Bankroll the bars and restaurants that would install his machines, finance the clubs and motels that would house his operations, and build a network of trusted men who could keep the operation running without his direct involvement. The money was staggering. Even a decade later, the Texas State Attorney General reported that Marcello's gambling syndicate in the state numbered over 800 bookmakers, handling revenues in the millions. And that was just what was known. But gambling was only part of the equation. Marcello had a foothold in industries that were far more difficult to trace. The Pelican Tomato Company, for instance, was one of the biggest importers of tomatoes from Mexico, its largest single customer none other than the US Navy. It was a legitimate front, but one with a darker underside. Customs officials looked the other way, and no one dared to ask what else might be getting shipped across the border. The Marcello influence wasn't just economic, it was political. Texas had been bought and paid for, one campaign at a time. His key bagman in the state, a man named Jack Halfon, made sure of it. Halfon funneled a portion of Marcello's illegal profits straight into the pockets of Texas power players, men like Houston Congressman Albert Thomas, Supreme Court Associate Justice Tom Clark, and, most notably, U.S. Senator Lyndon Johnson. It was estimated that at least $50,000 a year from Marcello's gambling profits alone ended up in Johnson's coffers. And, in return, Johnson helped ensure that any federal legislation that might harm Marcello's business interests never made it out of committee. With Vice President Johnson in his corner, Marcello had a protective shield that even Robert Kennedy's war on organized crime couldn't penetrate. Dallas in 1963 was Marcello's playground. The police? Bought. The politicians? Complicit. His enforcer? A Sicilian-born, Louisiana-raised gangster named Joseph Civello. Civello had been a key figure in the underworld for decades. A bookmaker, a liquor dealer, a suspected murderer, and a narcotics smuggler who had been Marcello's man in Dallas for years. He was so trusted that in 1957, when the top mafia bosses in the country gathered in Appalachian, New York, it was Civello whom Marcello sent as his personal representative. He returned to Dallas to a storm of negative press, but the heat didn't last long. The city's police force, which had long ignored his dealings, kept his name out of any real trouble. And then there was Jack Ruby. 6 years after Appalachian, Civello's influence still ran through Dallas like a live wire. He was leasing Marcello's slot machines, running the racing wire service, and keeping a tight grip on the local underworld. He also had close ties to another Sicilian family in the city, the Campisis. Joe and Sam Campisi were restaurant owners, but their Egyptian lounge was far more than just a place to eat. It was an underworld meeting ground, a place where deals were made, and where men like Civello came and went through the back door, unseen by the general public, but well known to the FBI. One name that would later surface in connection with the Campisis: Lee Harvey Oswald's killer. In the days before he shot Oswald in the basement of the Dallas police headquarters, Jack Ruby ate dinner at the Egyptian lounge. The Campisis, like Civello, had been longtime friends of Carlos Marcello. The connections were deep. Too deep. The FBI later found extensive phone records linking Marcello's enterprises in New Orleans to Campisi's restaurant in Dallas. And in 1978, when investigators finally questioned Joe Campisi, he admitted to a long-standing friendship with Marcello. He even bragged about how every Christmas he sent Marcello 260 pounds of Italian sausage, made special with walnuts and celery. By the time 1963 rolled around, the Marcello organization operated with impunity in Dallas. Their men weren't just bookies and club owners. They were embedded in the police force itself. One sergeant, Patrick Dean, was so deeply tied to the organization that he was spotted having dinner with Civello just days after the Appalachian meeting. That same Sergeant Dean would be in charge of basement security at the Dallas police headquarters when Jack Ruby pulled the trigger and silenced Lee Harvey Oswald forever. The Mafia had a saying: nothing is a coincidence. The Kennedy assassination was barely over before the coincidences began stacking up. Coincidences that in the world of Carlos Marcello, Jimmy Hoffa, and David Ferry weren't coincidences at all. One name kept surfacing again and again: David Ferry. Ferry, the bizarre red wig-wearing pilot with a penchant for young boys and high-stakes gambling. A man who had been close to Oswald since 1955, years before the world would even know the name Lee Harvey Oswald. A man who worked not only for Carlos Marcello, but whose name was whispered in CIA circles. And, if Frank Sheeran's story was true, a man whose role in the assassination was more than just a footnote. Sheeran, the Irishman, a trusted enforcer for Russell Bufalino and a confidant of Jimmy Hoffa, had kept his mouth shut for decades. But when he finally talked, the details were staggering. In 1963, Hoffa had sent Sheeran on a delivery. A duffel bag containing 3 to 4 rifles, flown from Baltimore to a destination unknown. Sheeran, never one to ask too many questions, didn't open the bag, didn't handle the weapons. But he knew what they were for. A contingency. A backup. Because things like this needed backup. The FBI file on Tony Provenzano backed up Sheeran's story. On the exact date Sheeran claimed he made the drop, an Irish-looking individual matching Sheeran's description was seen picking up a rucksack under surveillance. Coincidence? Not likely. The November 21, 2015 documentary capturing Oswald filled in more gaps. Detective Jim Livell, the officer handcuffed to Oswald when Jack Ruby fired the fatal shot, dropped the bombshell. They had laid out 3 or 4 routes to take. The president's motorcade had multiple possible paths, any of which could have been chosen at the last minute, which meant backup rifle teams were necessary. The Baltimore Rifles, one of those contingencies. Then there was Sergeant Patrick Dean, a Dallas police officer with deep ties to the Dallas underworld. Dean had sat down with Joseph Civello, the head of Marcello's Dallas operations, just days before the assassination. And who was in charge of Oswald's security detail once he was arrested? Sergeant Patrick Dean, the same Sergeant Dean who was the planted witness for Melvin Belly, Jack Ruby's lawyer. The same Sergeant Dean who, it's now believed, was the man who leaked the final motorcade route to his Mafia co-conspirators. Because if there were 4 potential routes, the Mafia needed to know which one would be chosen. And someone inside the Dallas Police Department had to give them that answer. Oswald was on the inside. He knew which route was his responsibility. He had his own rifle, the one he was comfortable with, but he was never meant to survive past Sunday morning. Jack Ruby, Marcello's man, made sure of that. Years later, the Warren Commission would dismiss any organized crime connection to the assassination of John F. Kennedy. But those who had spent their lives studying the underworld knew better. Dallas was Marcello's city. His men controlled the rackets. His men controlled the police. And when the most shocking event in modern American history unfolded in the streets of Dealey Plaza, his network was already in place. But even before the shots rang out in Dallas, the winds of change were blowing. By the mid-1970s, law enforcement agencies were finally starting to put the pieces together. The Texas Organized Crime Prevention Council identified over 160 men in the state with Mafia ties, 32 of them full members. The Associated Press launched a probe into the state's underworld, interviewing a former Mafia leader who had come to Texas looking for a fresh start, only to find that the mob had beaten him there. "It's a great big watermelon," the man told the reporters, "ripe for the plucking." The pluckers had arrived. Even beyond the old Marcello network, fresh players were making moves. The West Coast Mafia was beginning to challenge the New Orleans hold over Texas. Old alliances were fraying, and rival factions were circling. In a Dallas hotel club, an aging East Coast mobster sat down for dinner, his .38 caliber pistol hidden beneath a red napkin, watching, waiting. The mobsters in Texas, he said, were getting ready for the day when gambling would be legalized in the state. Massive land holdings had already been secured, bribes had already been paid, and politicians had already been bought. But the key to everything? Getting the right people in your pocket. Carlos Marcello had done that better than anyone. Even as law enforcement cracked down, even as new enemies emerged, the little man of New Orleans still had his grip on Texas. His name was whispered in connection with a real estate empire tied to the mob. His men still controlled gambling rings in Dallas and Houston, and his people still moved money through seemingly legitimate businesses. But the clock was ticking. Federal prosecutors were coming after him. Investigators were digging deeper into his ties to politicians and businesses across Texas. The headlines were catching up to the rumors. And for the first time in decades, there was the hint of something Marcello had never had to deal with before. A war on the horizon. While the world's eyes were on Dallas, where President John Kennedy's motorcade rolled through Dealey Plaza, something else was unfolding in New Orleans. In a federal courtroom, Carlos Marcello, the man Bobby Kennedy once called the most powerful racketeer in the country, was watching the final act of his latest battle with the United States government. The stakes? Conspiracy charges. The government claimed Marcello and his brother Joseph had cooked up a phony Guatemalan birth certificate, a slick maneuver from back in 1956, meant to throw off the feds who were trying to ship him to Italy. The whole case reflected the government's obsession with Carlos, an obsession that wore Bobby Kennedy's fingerprints from top to bottom. 2 weeks the trial ran, and by that Friday morning they were almost at the finish line. U.S. District Judge Herbert Christenberry had already knocked down the defense's motion for an acquittal. The case was going to the jury. But the government's star witness, a man named Carl Irving Knoll, and Knoll was a problem. Knoll was a classic hustler, a con man, according to Mrs. Yvonne Klein, a woman from Wilmette, Illinois, who torched his credibility on the stand. Knoll had claimed he bribed Guatemalan officials to get Marcello's fake birth certificate, but Mrs. Klein told the jury that Knoll had actually made those trips for her, tied to some grand, far-fetched $200 million building project. The government's carefully built, started to sag under its own weight. But then came the timing. That timing. As the jury deliberated, the news broke from Dallas. The president, Bobby's brother, shot, dead. The courtroom buzzed with whispers, but the proceedings didn't stop. Marcello, stone-faced, watched and waited. Carlos Marcello sat in a courtroom in New Orleans, expressionless, as Judge Herbert Christenbury delivered his charge to the jury. The air was thick with tension. This was the moment that would decide his fate. The case had been long, draining, and for Marcello, personal. The full weight of Robert Kennedy's Justice Department had been thrown against him. And now, after years of fighting, it all came down to this. Then the courtroom door swung open. A bailiff hurried to the judge's bench and handed him a note. Christenbury read it in silence. His face paled. The tension shifted, morphed into something heavier, something that had nothing to do with Carlos Marcello. When the judge finally spoke, his voice wavered. "The president has been shot in Dallas and is feared dead." The courtroom erupted, murmurs, gasps, a rising wave of confusion that had to be tamped down by the judge himself. The world had just changed. But Carlos Marcello and his brother Joe, they showed nothing. No emotion, no reaction. As chaos unfolded around them, they calmly rose from their seats, buttoned their jackets, and walked out with their attorneys. Meanwhile, across the country, in the quiet of his Virginia estate, Robert Kennedy sat poolside, eating a lunch of clam chowder and tuna fish sandwiches with two of his closest allies, Robert Morgenthau and Silvio Mollo, the men leading his crusade against organized crime. The phone rang. It was Hoover. "I have news for you. The president's been shot." The voice on the other end was clinical, emotionless, almost robotic. Kennedy gripped the receiver, his mind reeling. "I think it's serious. I'll call you back when I find out more." And then, 30 minutes later, Hoover called again, his tone unchanged. "The president's dead." Bobby Kennedy said nothing. The man who had spent years wielding the full power of the Justice Department, who had made it his mission to crush men like Carlos Marcello, sat frozen. The war he had waged had just taken a turn he had never anticipated. His brother, his protector, his shield, was gone. At that exact moment in New Orleans, the courtroom reconvened. By 3 in the afternoon, the jury had returned. At 15 minutes past 3, the foreman stood to read the verdict. "On the charge of conspiracy, not guilty. On the charge of perjury, not guilty." A total acquittal. Carlos Marcello, the man Robert Kennedy had spent years hunting, the man whose empire the Justice Department had tried and failed to dismantle, had walked free on the very day his greatest enemy had been eliminated. Outside the courthouse, Marcello barely acknowledged his victory. He shook hands with his attorneys, accepted congratulations from friends and family, but there was no celebration, no parade. He walked out arm in arm with his wife, climbed into a waiting car, and disappeared into the city. According to one observer, he was all business, skipping any family gathering to head straight to his office at the Town Country Motel. There was something urgent on his mind. Hours later, at New Orleans International Airport, 2 men met in the shadows, George Alamilla and Rudolf Heitler. Heitler had been a juror in Marcello's trial, one of the 12 who had just voted not guilty. Now, in a quiet exchange, Heitler admitted that not only had he voted for Marcello's acquittal, but he had convinced several of his fellow jurors to do the same. Alamilla didn't hesitate. Heitler had done a great job. The next day, he was to see Joe Matassa, Marcello's man, for his reward. The timing was impossible to ignore. 1 year earlier, in September 1962, in the private confines of Churchill Farms, Carlos Marcello had spat out a Sicilian proverb to an associate. "A dog will keep biting you if you cut off its tail. But if you cut off its head, the dog will die, tail and all." A year later, John Kennedy was dead. The old order had crumbled, the power dynamic had shifted, and those who had been under siege from Bobby Kennedy's war on organized crime were now breathing easier. Jimmy Hoffa, a man who had suffered under the relentless legal attacks of the Kennedy brothers, was blunt in his reaction. When the news of the assassination reached him, he sneered, "Bobby Kennedy is just another lawyer now." Perhaps even less than that. In the weeks that followed, Robert Kennedy fell into a state of paralysis. To those around him, he seemed broken. Pierre Salinger, the former White House press secretary, later recalled that he was the most shattered man he had ever seen. A Justice Department official put it more bluntly. He was non-functioning. The war against the mob lost its momentum, and Carlos Marcello, he remained untouchable. There would be investigations, whispers, and theories, hushed discussions in Washington, tense conversations behind closed doors. But the reality was simple. The government's war against Carlos Marcello had ended the moment John Kennedy died. Marcello wasn't finished, though. Not by a long shot. In the coming years, the fallout will spread. More names would be dragged into the conspiracy: Jack Ruby, Joseph Civello, Joe Campisi, and a web of connections that stretched from Dallas to New Orleans. But on November 22nd, 1963, the most powerful mafia boss in the South walked out of a courtroom a free man, his empire intact, his war won. And Robert Kennedy. He was alone in the wreckage. Carlos Marcello sat in his office at the Town Country Motel, his inner sanctum, surrounded by men who had seen wars waged in courtrooms, alleys, and backrooms. He had beaten the United States government, embarrassed Robert Kennedy, and walked free on the very day the President of the United States had been shot dead in Dallas. Fate, it seemed, had a twisted sense of irony. Then the news came. A phone call. A whisper in the ear. Dutz Murrett's kid had been arrested in Dallas. The name didn't mean much to most. But to Marcello, it did. Lee Harvey Oswald, the boy from New Orleans, a nobody, a drifter. But now, a suspect in the most explosive murder in American history. If Marcello had any connection to the assassination, if there was even the faintest trace back to him, then Oswald's arrest wasn't just an inconvenience, it was a catastrophe. He had spent years building an empire that stretched from New Orleans to Dallas, Houston to Shreveport, Baton Rouge to Miami. It had survived deportation, FBI investigations, and Senate hearings. But an empire was only as strong as its weakest link. And now Lee Oswald was sitting in a Dallas jail cell, facing police officers, and God knows how many federal agents. Carlos Marcello knew what needed to be done. Inside the interrogation room at Dallas Police Headquarters, Lee Harvey Oswald sat under the harsh glare of overhead lights. The air was thick with cigarette smoke, the walls vibrating with the chatter of reporters, officers, and federal agents scrambling to make sense of the unthinkable. The President of the United States was dead, and the suspect sitting in front of them was an enigma wrapped in contradictions. A former US Marine who had defected to the Soviet Union, only to return under bizarre and unexplained circumstances. A man who had recently been in New Orleans, causing a scene with pro-Castro leaflets, and yet was deeply connected to the very forces that despised Castro the most. A man who, in custody, kept repeating one phrase over and over: "I'm just a patsy." As the interrogation stretched into the night, Oswald's family began arriving at the police station. First his mother, Marguerite Oswald, a woman who talked fast and had no filter. From the moment she arrived, she was loud, insistent, and unapologetically conspiratorial. "My son," she declared, "was working for the United States government." The detectives barely reacted. Half of them thought she was just another overdramatic mother in denial. But as she kept talking, some of them found themselves shifting in their chairs. "He was a patriot," she insisted. "He went to Russia on behalf of the CIA. He was sent there. And now they're trying to blame him for something he didn't do." It sounded insane, but decades later, investigators would discover that she wasn't far off the mark. Oswald had ties to the CIA. Oswald had been part of intelligence operations. And Oswald was not just some random drifter who snapped one day and killed the president. To Carlos Marcello, however, that's exactly what Oswald would have looked like. A nobody, a hothead, a man who had been in the wrong places, at the wrong times, with the wrong people. But Oswald's past wasn't as simple as it seemed. Before Dallas, before November 22nd, 1963, before his mugshot was plastered on front pages across the world, Lee Harvey Oswald had been in New Orleans. And in New Orleans, Oswald had been part of something bigger. He had ties to men like David Ferry, a CIA-linked pilot who worked for Carlos Marcello, to men like Guy Bannister, a former FBI agent turned anti-Castro extremist with an office at 544 Camp Street, the same building Oswald used for his so-called pro-Castro organization. Oswald had been part of something that, on the surface, made no sense. He was openly handing out pro-Castro leaflets, yet he was surrounded by anti-Castro operatives. He was loudly defending the Cuban Revolution, yet he had been spotted in the company of anti-Castro Cuban exiles. He was arrested for a staged street fight with Cuban exiles, but instead of quietly leaving, he demanded to be taken to the police station and filed paperwork. Why? Because Oswald was building a cover story. The DRE, Directorio Revolucionario Estudiantil, a Cuban exile group funded by the CIA, was running a misinformation campaign in New Orleans, and Oswald was a piece of that puzzle. The staged fight, the pamphlets, the arrest, it was all an act, a way to paint Oswald as a radical nobody, a pro-Castro lone wolf. And when the time came, that false persona would be his death sentence. Because the moment Kennedy was shot, Oswald's past wasn't going to be investigated, it was going to be used against him. By Saturday, November 23rd, as the nation mourned its fallen leader, David Ferry, one of Marcello's most trusted operatives, was already moving. Ferry had left New Orleans in the early evening of the 22nd, tearing across the highway in a light blue Comet station wagon, a Texas thunderstorm raging overhead. By 4 in the morning, Ferry and 2 companions, Alvin Bobeuf and Melvin Coffey, pulled into the Alamo Motel in Houston, a property owned by Marcello. Exhausted, soaked, but on a mission, Ferry wasted no time. He placed a call straight to the Town Country Motel in New Orleans. The FBI later claimed Ferry called Marcello's attorney, Ray Gill, but Gill wasn't supposed to be there that Saturday. And he wasn't. The call, almost certainly, was for Carlos Marcello himself. That weekend, Joe Matassa, Marcello's partner in the Pelican Tomato Company, was in a panic. He had promised ex-juror Rudolf Heitler a payoff for his not guilty vote in Marcello's trial. But now, Matassa couldn't reach Marcello. "He's laying low," Matassa told Heitler. "He's hard to get a hold of." And that was true. Marcello disappeared. The Town Country Motel had too many eyes, too many phones tapped, too many informants lurking in the shadows. If Oswald's name meant something, if Ferry's desperate drive to Texas meant something, then Marcello needed to be somewhere no one could reach him. He had a fortress for moments like this. Churchill Farms. That's where he likely went. His vast 6,000-acre compound outside New Orleans, a place where men came in but never came out. There, far from reporters and wiretaps, he could work in silence, letting the cleanup unfold on its own. Meanwhile, David Ferry's name was about to explode onto the front pages. The night of the assassination, Ferry's longtime associate, Guy Bannister, got into a violent bar fight with an investigator named Jack Martin. Bannister was a former FBI agent turned private investigator, running his operation out of 544 Camp Street, a building that just happened to be linked to Lee Harvey Oswald's Fair Play for Cuba Committee. The fight started over money, but as the argument escalated, Jack Martin, drunk, angry, and maybe scared, blurted out something chilling. "What are you going to do? Kill me like you all did Kennedy?" Bannister snapped. He grabbed his .357 Magnum, pistol-whipped Martin across the face, and beat him until blood ran down his scalp. Martin didn't call the police that night, but the next day he started talking. By Sunday, November 24th, Jack Martin had reached out to a friend in the New Orleans District Attorney's office. He had something to say about the Kennedy assassination, and it had to do with David Ferry. By Monday, November 25th, the New Orleans police, FBI, and Secret Service were all looking for Ferry. Jack Martin's tip had made its way to Assistant District Attorney Herman Coleman, and suddenly Ferry's rush to Houston didn't look so innocent. Where was Ferry? Carlos Marcello's lawyer, Ray Gill, suddenly had the answer. "Ferry's been in Texas," he told the DA's office, "but he'll be back in New Orleans soon." When Ferry finally turned himself in, he played it cool. He claimed the trip to Texas had nothing to do with Kennedy. He had just gone ice skating in Houston. It was the weakest excuse in the history of alibis. The FBI interrogated him. Secret Service grilled him. But they had nothing to hold him on. Ferry walked free. A clean-up complete. Oswald is silenced. But the real problem, the biggest problem of all, was still sitting in a Dallas jail cell. Lee Harvey Oswald. Marcello, if he were involved, would have known that Oswald needed to be silenced. Immediately. And that was a job that could only be done by someone inside the Dallas underworld. Enter Jack Ruby. Ruby was no lone gunman. He was a mob-connected nightclub owner, a man who had done business with the Campisi brothers, Joe and Sam, longtime Marcello allies. On Sunday morning, November 24th, 1963, Ruby received a mysterious phone call. Moments later, he grabbed his Colt Cobra revolver, left his apartment, and headed to the Dallas police headquarters. At 20 minutes past 11 in the morning, as millions watched on live television, Ruby pushed through the crowd, raised his gun, and fired a single bullet into Lee Harvey Oswald's gut. Oswald gasped, fell, and died less than 2 hours later. The weakest link had been severed. Years later, House Select Committee investigators would dig deep into Marcello's Dallas connections. They found that Oswald had ties to New Orleans. Oswald had been linked to David Ferry as early as 1955. Marcello and Ferry had an airtight alibi for November 22nd, but crime bosses always arranged airtight alibis before big jobs. Jack Ruby was a longtime associate of Marcello's Dallas contacts, and yet Carlos Marcello never spent a day in prison for anything related to the Kennedy assassination. Because in the world of organized crime, the best killings are the ones you never have to explain. Carlos Marcello, the little man, had cut off the head of the dog and lived the rest of his life in the shadows.